The first horror experience for Shinji Mikami was Yotsuya Kaiden, the popular Japanese ghost story that influenced him to see multiple horror movies throughout his young life. But one of the more interesting perspectives he had, it wasn't the adrenaline of being scared, he always thought about how he would have handled certain situations. That said, video games weren't part of his life. In fact, growing up, he dreamed of becoming an F1 driver. He studied product and merchandise in the business faculty of Doshisha Daigaku in Tokyo, and briefly became a banker until he attended a corporate party where Capcom were presenting, which really appealed to him. Though his application was rejected, he was hired a week later as a designer. For the first few years, he made mostly Disney tie-ins, including Who Framed Roger Rabbit for the Game Boy, and Goof Troop and Aladdin for the Super Nintendo. But then he was given the task of directing something on the opposite end of the mature scale, a game where one of the first things you were told to do before you start was play Sweet Home, a Famicom RPG based on the film with the same name, which is widely considered to be the first true survival horror. Back then you had video games with horror themes like Castlevania, Doom, and Capcom's own Ghosts and Goblins to name a few, but Sweet Home was the one where you couldn't just rely on brute force to survive. You always focused on what was in your inventory, and if a supporting character dies, they're gone for good. It was directed by Takeru Fujiwara, who was basically the skipper of Capcom's success on the NES, directing Commando, Ghosts and Goblins, and produced the Mega Man series and a majority of the Disney tie-ins that Mikami directed. And in 1993, this new horror game was just another project to entrust him with and expand on the features taken from Sweet Home. It was originally conceived as a Super Nintendo title, and although not much is said about how it would have looked like on the system, it would have most likely been a 16-bit Sweet Home with a few additional features. It kind of makes you wonder if Capcom ever considered a spin-off in that style. Maybe hire an indie developer to make it. But anyway, with the announcement of the Sony PlayStation the same year where 3D graphics were taking the industry by storm, Capcom decided to capitalize on the firepower by making this new horror game as something that would represent the company for the next generation. An obviously successful move in hindsight, but equally as risky at the time. In 1993, there were plenty of horror fans worldwide, but the only survival horror that existed outside of Japan was Alone in the Dark, and as groundbreaking as that game was for the genre, it wasn't very successful over the first few years. It wasn't as mind-blowing as something like Doom. Basically, it was a niche market and Takeru Fujiwara expected around 200,000 copies to be sold. But on the upside, it gave Shinji Mikami to think outside the box, test unconventional ideas. With most of the inspiration coming from George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, that slow pace and sense of vulnerability. He was given 6 months to work on a concept by himself before the development team eventually grew to 80, and after 3 years of work, on March 1996, Biohazard was released for the PlayStation in Japan, and the rest of the world by August as Resident Evil. According to Chris Kramer, who was Senior Director of Communications and Community at Capcom USA at the time, the reason for the name change is because the word Biohazard was already used for another video game and hardcore band, so getting the rights to the name for this game would be, in his word, impossible. The company had a contest to come up with a new name, and the marketing group agreed that Resident Evil was the best choice. Kramer was initially against it because it sounded cheesier than the dialogue in the actual game, which I'll get to. I mean, think about it. Resident Evil translates to a house with evil in it. Saying that out loud, it sounds like something out of an NES Castlevania monologue. But now that it's become one of the most recognizable names in video gaming, I wouldn't call it cheesy anymore. Of course, I'm going to call it Resident Evil for this review. We're looking at the director's cut specifically, and I also won't be mentioning the remake because it came out the next generation and it deserves its own video. Now, I've lost count over how many times I've mentioned how I was only a little kid at the time the PlayStation 1 was at its peak, so there was no chance I was able to experience some of the more mature titles, including Metal Gear Solid, Silent Hill, Grand Theft Auto, and of course Resident Evil, for obvious reasons. Therefore, I didn't become interested in the series growing up. The only Resident Evil games I've played a little bit of are the remake of Resident Evil 2 at PAX in 2018 and the fourth one, and I only got it for the Nintendo GameCube review a few years ago. However, thanks to Ruffian Shark, it's the Patreon request for this month, so I can't escape the terror anymore. Don't forget that if you support on Patreon, you can vote which game you want me to review. So here we are, another iconic title which I'm playing for the first time. Is the genesis of the series on the PlayStation still a classic that can scare the crap out of you? On July 24, 1998, a bunch of brutal murders are taking place on the outskirts of Raccoon City, so the police department sent in the STARS team to investigate what's going on. Unfortunately, contact with Bravo was lost, so they sent another team, Alpha, to investigate that as well. They found a destroyed helicopter and one of the dead Bravo members. Suddenly, a herd of dogs attack Alpha, killing another one of the members, which causes the helicopter pilot to panic and fly away, leaving the whole team behind. How professional. So whoever's still alive, flee to the Spencer mansion.
What is this?
Wow, what a mansion!
I don't know what happened.
They think they're safe from the dogs outside, but while the Alpha team continue their investigation, they realize that isn't the case at all, as anything that was living inside is either undead, enhanced, or both.
This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
Whether you play as Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, your job is to find anyone alive what's possessing this mansion and escape it.
If we stay here, all of us will end up dead.
Okay, first of all, I don't like that the mansion is named after me. Secondly, right from the moment you hear the first line, you immediately realize that the dialogue and voice acting is horrendous. By far the most notorious aspect of the first Resident Evil, and I honestly don't know how to explain it for this review. Like, what hasn't been said about it?
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
In literally every aspect, it's poorly executed. The lines are about as basic as a brick wall delivered like a robot. It delays every 2 seconds whenever someone is saying something. It makes the characters appear more incompetent than they actually are, and it creates scenarios which don't make sense. Like finding Rebecca in a storage room.
It's me, Chris.
Is that you, Rebecca?
A few seconds later, she starts playing the piano. Meanwhile, hordes of undead are invading the mansion.
Oh, that was great.
Yeah, I know it's a puzzle which helps advance through the game, but point is, a conversation like that does not fit.
Chris, be careful.
It's like the developers made the whole game, the mansion, items, weapons, control, enemy design, placement, and then thought about what pieces of dialogue and cutscenes to throw in there.
A moment ago I heard someone's voice coming from this hole. Let's go together since it's dark and we can't see very well.
Now, Japan have an incredible reputation when it comes to the horror genre, but according to Yoshirio Mpo, I swear my pronunciations get worse every video, because all the development staff were Japanese and making a story set in the US, even the Japanese version has English audio with American actors who just happened to live in Japan at the time. By the way, their real identities are still a myth to this day. This led to poor localization, and is one of the main reasons why they wanted to remake it in 2002.
I'm sorry, but I have my reasons. Perhaps you guys have met them? It was all I could do to protect myself against those strange creatures.
I want to be careful with what I say because a lot of the gamers love the cheesy dialogue. And do you know what? I do too. That's the saving grace. It falls under the category of so bad it's good.
But something's wrong with this house.
Whoa! This hall is dangerous.
I have to go through this door. That's the door over there. Be careful. There could be monsters ahead. They are dangerous.
Okay, let's separate again.
Tale as old as time. Actually, do you know what? I'm not being sarcastic about that. You have to understand that it was the mid-90s. Games were still being made for the Super Nintendo and Sega Mega Drive. Voices in video games were in their infancy, and what it lacks in clarity makes up for it everywhere else. When the Alpha team find enough clues to understand what's really going on, how the Bravo team got stuck, it's more than just a supernatural force. This is why I think they should have called this game Resident Evil Worldwide. It would be too much of a giveaway for first timers if the game was called Biohazard. I suppose looking at how much the franchise has evolved, it doesn't really matter anymore. Despite how long the game takes, it does a good job with building things up slowly. With the diary entries, the type of enemies, where you encounter them, there's a little whiff of the science fiction genre thrown in there too, and it has an unpredictable atmosphere that you won't be forgetting anytime soon if you scare easily. and a lot of it comes down to the gameplay. It uses pre-rendered backgrounds to give the illusion that you're in a 3D room, which looks less pixelated than something like Metal Gear Solid. It was one of many ideas Shinji Mikami worked on when he had the project to himself. He even played around with a first-person view like Doom, something that would eventually be implemented in RE7 Biohazard 2 decades later. But after discovering Alone in the Dark, he decided to go with the pre-rendered look, and has become synonymous with the Resident Evil series during the PlayStation 1 era. Mikami initially feared it would ruin the experience since the camera view is completely static, and analog sticks on PlayStation DualShocks didn't exist yet, so it utilizes tank controls, that way the camera angle can keep swapping around and controller movement remains intact. But after half an hour of gameplay you don't even think about it, and what it creates is a rare instance where being blindsided enhances the experience, because if you're playing this for the first time even in 2020, the jump scares are still... There's something about the horror genre that works better in video games compared to movies, because you're the one trying to keep the characters alive, so there's more pressure.
I have a rope here.
Oh, do you? Well, then I'll try to go down using the rope.
Well, at least for the player. Resident Evil isn't creepy to the point where I was having nightmares throughout the making of this review, but for an early PlayStation 1 title, I'm surprised. So I can't imagine back in 1996 doing a really good job scaring gamers. But then how do you define scary? Some people get more frightened than others, so what you and I think will vary based on experience. The least I can say is if you have a phobia to certain monsters, animals, or insects, you're not going to enjoy this game in the right way. You know, that's the point. Every time you enter a new room with a different song playing in the background, which is another fantastic part of the game, an effective way to maintain tension, you always think, oh no, what now? Because thanks to the one-shot camera angles that change whenever you move to another area, they can appear when you least suspect it. It's the anticipation that gets you. And when you do take action, it's almost just as unpredictable. The zombies, for example, take 3 to 5 bullets before going down, and even then it isn't guaranteed they're properly dead. Most of the time they get back up, maybe more than once, further adding to the pressure. The tank controls aren't as clunky as I was initially expecting, or at least it isn't the worst thing about the gameplay. Just point the gun wherever you want to fire, and if you have the director's cut, it instantly locks onto the enemy the second you press the aim button. There are plenty of weapons to choose from, including pistols, shotguns, and bazookas with their own unique ammo like explosives and fire rounds. And to keep yourself alive, you find different colored herbs which you can mix to replenish health or cure poisons. However, while it works well when walking through corridors, taking out zombies, it feels very awkward whenever you take on something more agile in high numbers, particularly hunters and boss battles, since you can't rotate nor move as quickly as them. You can make the argument that the more limited controls add to the tension, but sometimes you have to draw the line between scary and frustrating, and that's what happens when you program it for a specific genre. It doesn't work in other scenarios when you really want it to. Metal Gear Solid titles have the same issue. Incredibly tight stealth gameplay, but when it comes to boss battles, I've lost count on how many times I went into a prone position instead of trying to jump out of the way. And it's not like you can just wail away all your firepower. You have to think about which enemy to take out since they don't respawn, fortunately, and which one to avoid so you can walk past them to preserve ammunition, which is another key feature of Resident Evil. The mansion is a non-linear map where you explore as many of the rooms as possible for clues to unlock another one, whether it's a hidden item or puzzle that's different than the other. Most of these are very well designed. I would be perplexed occasionally. In fact, it took me over 10 minutes just to figure out that I was supposed to press X to walk up and down stairs, but every time I switch the game off and reload it, I always unlock or gather one item or room that progresses the story further. You will eventually work it out. However, you can only carry so many items and weapons at once, including ammo and health, so you need to be strategic with what you're carrying whilst having to defend yourself and waste as little ammo as possible.
Oh no, I should have brought some with me.
There are a couple of storage rooms to swap around whatever you need and save your progress, though you can never be 100% prepared on the first attempt, and this can be both a good and bad thing. Because you don't know what's going to appear in either the next room or camera angle when you unlock that door, it provides those aforementioned moments that make Resident Evil such an iconic survival horror. Unlikely enemy placement, that alertness keeping you on your toes, and if you die going as far as you felt you thought you could go, after you reload your progress, you think about what to do next and improve.
We got to the root of the problem.
But on the flip side, I might not have a specific item, or if I find something of note, most of the time I don't have enough room to grab it. So I have to painstakingly run back to a storage room, get what I need to free up space, run all the way back. Next thing, I find another item I can't pick up, because either Chris or Jill don't understand the concept of dropping items unless they're useless, or it could be a boss battle and you don't have enough firepower equipped. It's just a guessing game, and it's not like you can save every single time you enter a storage room or find a typewriter. Well, you can, but you can only save a certain number of times depending on how many ink ribbons you have, which are also an item that takes up space in your inventory to swap around, so theoretically it takes over a minute to save it before you go back to exploring again, and whatever character you select at the beginning will either reduce or magnify this issue. When you play as Jill, you have a lockpick that can be used on almost every door that requires a mansion key, 2 extra stuff to carry at once, and you find more ammo laying around. Play as Chris, you have none of these things at the beginning, not even a gun, nor does a bazooka even exist. Ammo is harder to come across, and although he takes more damage from enemies and draws his weapon faster, he has way more roadblocks to clear and monsters to run past. Now, I didn't know any of this when I started playing. Okay, I knew there would be differences, but I didn't know Chris was the harder version. I literally started playing the game for the first time ever as him, and almost prepared for a review of a game that has aged terribly. Either that or I was completely rubbish at it. I even assumed it was linear, and although I was trying my best to make every bullet count, I just went for every enemy in sight, so unless you're good at using the knife, playing it that way was a waste of time, especially when I started playing as Jill. I ended up making it to the first boss in less than half the time as Chris. It feels like the training mode in comparison. Point is, it isn't as clear at the beginning which character is the harder mode. I only picked Chris because he was the first option, therefore my impression of Resident Evil could have gone either way. But even if you play as Jill for the first time, beat it, and decide to explore the mansion as Chris after that, all you're essentially doing with him is the same thing but firing less bullets, running back to the storage room more, a lot more, and because the puzzles, enemy placement, types, and jump scares are mostly identical, it isn't as scary either. On the plus side at least, it adds plenty of replay value since both playthroughs only take around 5 hours. It depends on how well you know the puzzles and comprehend the tank controls. And you have another supporting character helping you with your investigation, aka unique but still terrible dialogue,
Chris, take care.
as well as alternate story branches which affect the ending, encouraging you to figure out how to get the best one, even if the scariness takes a significant dip. Resident Evil on the PlayStation is another one of those games where, despite what it might look like on the surface today with its outdated graphics and tank controls, if you don't count the dialogue, there's only one glaring issue. Glaring enough that I occasionally stop playing the game out of boredom. That's how tedious it can be running back and forth to the same room every few minutes. But it's also not knowing what lies ahead in the next room that creates a lot of what makes Resident Evil scary to begin with. An iconic series has to start somewhere. It certainly improves on Sweet Home, and has generated a series that has come so far, we forget just how important and revolutionary the original is. It not only paved the way for other survival horror franchises like Silent Hill, Parasite Eve, and Capcom's very own Dino Crisis, but according to many filmmakers including George A. Romero, it also made zombies a legitimate box office draw in movies again, as well as having its own film franchise that lasted a decade. decade. So going to the original question, is the first Resident Evil worth playing today? Well, for its scare factor, only if you've never played it before, or if you can't remember where any of the enemies are. And make sure it's Jill first, don't do what I did and select Chris at the beginning. However, rating it based on the impact it had on video games in the 90s, it definitely deserves to be hailed as one of the best on the PlayStation.